I remember loving going to amusement parks as a kid, especially one called Fantasy Park. It had a Disney princess theme. The park was more like a pirated version of the original Disney princesses, I guess because of legal issues, but it was still cool and super fun. Since it was close to my house, I went every summer with my parents, Jaime, my younger brother. It was kind of a family tradition that left me with the best memories. But things changed when my dad got a job in another city and we had to move. Then it became complicated to go back to Fantasy Park every year, which was pretty sad for me because I loved going there. However, almost when I was about to graduate from high school, my aunt, who still lived in my old hometown, told me that overnight the park closed for unknown reasons, and I was sad to hear about it, but I was too focused on finals and college applications to get too depressed. It wasn't until after I graduated and moved away from home that I decided to return to visit my favorite childhood amusement park. Going back to Fantasy Park was kind of unfinished business for me, so I decided to go back there as a way to reconnect with my childhood and fulfill that longing I'd had for so many years, even though the place was in ruins. So that summer I traveled back to my hometown and stayed at the hotel closest to the park. My original idea was to return with my brother, but he preferred to travel to Norway with his fiancée, so I decided to undertake the adventure on my own. Since I was only going to be there for a weekend, I couldn't waste much time, so I headed for the ruins of the park the same afternoon I arrived in town. As far as I knew, it wasn't the first time someone had explored those ruins, but technically I was trespassing, so I'd better not be seen or I might get in trouble. So I opted to do it late in the afternoon. I also put on goggles, a cap, and a face shield, so if anyone saw me, they wouldn't recognize me. When I arrived at the entrance, I felt a cold chill in my stomach at the sight of that huge gate, which, except for being half rusted and with faded paint, was exactly the same as I remembered it. I quickly hopped the fence, walked through the gates, and entered Fantasy Park for the first time since I was 11 years old. Obviously, a lot had changed since my last visit, but I could still recognize the place that had been such an important and treasured part of my childhood. The rides that had once thrilled me so much and the long lines were rusted and dilapidated from neglect. The food stands were destroyed, decayed by time, and the plaster animals and the giant Ferris wheel, which used to be the highlight of the park, was in a sorry state, on the verge of falling down. As sad as it was to see all that crumbling, I couldn't help but feel a little happy to be back there one last time. So I wanted to capture the moment and save it forever. I took out my phone and started taking pictures. Cinderella's pumpkin carriage, the now dry water ride with the little boats in the shape of teacups, Rapunzel's now half-ruined tower, the artificial bush maze that emulated the Queen of Hearts garden from Alice in Wonderland. I got a little lost in that maze, and when I finally made it out, night had fallen, so I was getting ready to leave before it became dangerous. But just as I passed the entrance to the maze, I heard something that made me stop. A soft voice, like a child's, whispered behind me. I turned around and saw a dark-haired girl about 7 years old in a frayed green dress, looking at me with big, pleading eyes but without uttering a word. I stood there, astonished, not knowing what to say. "Hey, hello," I managed to articulate after catching my breath. "What are you doing here?" The girl didn't answer. She just continued to look at me with those intense brown eyes that seemed to see deep inside me. I don't know if I can say that I was completely calm, to be honest. Actually, I felt a little scared. But I couldn't leave that little girl alone in those ruins. I also didn't know what such a little girl could be doing in that place and at that hour. "Hello, little one, are you lost?" I asked. "Do you know where your parents are?" She said nothing, just turned around and ran off behind a bush. "Wait!" I shouted. I didn't want her to get lost in the maze like I had. So I ran after her, rounding the corner just in time to see the hem of her green dress fade into the corner to the left. My footsteps echoed among the crumbling structures, and each time I twisted into a new path, I could just catch a glimpse of her dress at the end of the maze, as if she was making sure I was following her. Finally, I managed to catch up with her in the clearing of the maze, a place with no nooks and crannies to hide in. She stopped in front of a large statue of the Queen of Hearts, her back to me. It was the same figure I had seen several times while trying to get out of there. "Don't go away again, will you?" I said, breathing heavily from exhaustion, but she didn't seem tired at all. "Stay there. I'm going to call the police. They will help you, I promise." The girl shook her head, still looking away. "It's too late for that now," she replied with a sadness in her voice that froze my heart. Before I could inquire what she meant, she turned to face me. The first time I caught a glimpse of her face, I instantly wished I hadn't. Half of her face was wide open. Half of her face was completely open. I could see her white skull between the torn parts of her skin, and one eye hung from its socket, swinging over her pale cheek like a terrifying pendulum. At that moment I struggled to scream, but the terror left me paralyzed. I could not believe my eyes. Without saying a word, the girl turned around again, and then I saw her dive into the ground in front of the sculpture. It was then that I noticed that the ground had been disturbed. A small mound was hidden in the undergrowth, barely the size of a basketball. As soon as I managed to regain control over myself, I approached it to examine it more closely. At that moment, my whole body was telling me to run away from that place, but curiosity got the better of me. I was terrified by what I had just seen, but I also wanted to see what was there. It was then when, among the dirt, I saw what appeared to be a small bone of a finger. A small finger that was undoubtedly that of a boy, or a girl. When I saw that, I started to scream and ran out of there in desperation. As soon as I was on the other side of the gate, I called the police. When they arrived, they naturally asked me what I was doing in a ruined amusement park, and detained me for a few days while they investigated what was under the statue of the Queen of Hearts. Fortunately, I managed to get off with minor trespassing charges after they confirmed that the remains had been there for at least 9 years. By the time I returned to my hometown, the police still hadn't been able to identify the girl, and there was no clue as to the person who put her there either. I don't even think she herself knows the answer. I just hope that, finally, her spirit will find peace after being trapped in that place for so long. It still gives me chills and breaks my heart to think of what could have happened to that innocent little girl for her body to end up buried in a shallow grave inside an abandoned amusement park. When I was in high school, my parents moved to a new neighborhood where there was an old uninhabited house right behind mine. Every time I walked by it, I could hear a strange sound as if electricity was sizzling inside. My parents would tell me that it had been empty for decades, but that electricity noise kept ringing insistently all the time. Whenever you walked by, you could hear it clearly. I was worried that somehow it might be connected and be a fire hazard, or that someone might get electrocuted or something. So one day I decided that I had to investigate, and for that, I invited my friend Steven. One Friday after leaving school, we headed to the abandoned house to investigate what that strange noise was and what was in there. But when we got there, I was a little hesitant about going in. The place looked pretty gloomy and had some kind of strange energy that could be perceived. It was something almost sinister. I don't know. That's how I felt. I asked Steven if it was scary, and he let out a laugh and said that it wasn't scary, it was more like pure excitement. I admired his enthusiasm because in reality, I was already getting scared. The old door opened with a terrifying creak, and we found ourselves inside the house. The first thing that caught my attention was that there was dog food scattered everywhere, and a pungent smell that made me wrinkle my nose. The funny thing is that the floor was covered with piles of dog poop, so we had to walk very carefully so as not to step in it. Suddenly, some kind of weird scream echoed from the second floor. Honestly, we should have left right then and there, but curiosity got the better of us, so we started climbing the stairs. As we climbed the last few steps, we noticed that from a room upstairs the sizzling sound of electricity started coming again, and then we heard a man's voice saying, "Don't spit it out, eat it." At that moment, Steven and I looked at each other, and I'm sure we both felt the same shiver run down our backs. We slowly approached the room, and when we peeked in, Stiff let out a scream of terror. Inside were 3 people sitting half naked on the floor, with dog leashes around their necks. They were 2 boys and a girl, and in front of them a guy was training them with a taser. The 3 of them looked at us silently, and then started screaming for help, as if they were going crazy. The man who was controlling them got nervous and started hitting them, ordering them to shut up, but their screams were so loud I thought their throats were going to explode. That's when he started tasering them with the gun. Seeing these boys convulsing on the floor from the electric shocks, a bunch of curses came out of my mouth involuntarily. In the midst of the chaos, the man became aware of our presence, and without wasting a second, he ran towards us with the gun in his hand. Obviously, Steven and I didn't think twice and shot out the door downstairs, but unfortunately Stiff didn't run fast enough and the guy caught him. His scream echoed down the hallway, as did the sound of the taser gun. For a second I thought about going back and helping him, but when I saw the guy with the taser nail his devilish eyes on me, I ran out of the house at full speed with my heart pounding, and as soon as I stepped on the street after jumping over the huge gate in a second, I dialed 911. However, as soon as the call connected, my phone died. I hadn't charged it since the night before. A resounding, "I'll be damned," came from my lips, and then, after a few minutes of pacing around the same spot not knowing what to do, I jumped the gate again and crept back into the house. I climbed the stairs again, trying to make as little noise as possible, and directed my steps towards the room where we saw the boys. I carefully peeked in the door and saw the man trying to put a dog collar on Steven, who seemed to be very dazed. Without thinking, I ran towards the guy full of rage and kicked him with all my strength in the back. The guy fell to the ground immediately, dropping the taser from the blow. I quickly picked it up and threatened her with it while giving him another couple of kicks in the face. The other 3 guys were passed out on the floor, but Stiff was awake, just very dizzy. I tried to get him to stand up so we could get out of there and call the police, but due to his condition I was having a hard time. However, after a few minutes I started to hear the sound of sirens. Hearing the police approaching, the guy tried to stand up and run away, but I immediately stood in the doorway and threatened him again with the taser, so he had no choice but to stay where he was. When I heard the officers come through the door, I started yelling, "Here, here." The officers entered the room, arrested the guy, and rescued both Steven and the rest of the victims. When we finally got out of the house, my legs felt like jelly. Although the rescue team was able to free the people who had been trapped there, they were in a deplorable state. They had been beaten and fed only dog food for weeks. When the officers asked the man why he had done such a horrible thing, he simply said he wanted to get new pets. I don't know if this guy was sick in the head or just a very sick and twisted person, but in the end they locked him up in prison. Fortunately, Steven was able to recover with treatment, but the trauma stayed with him for a long time. We never went near that house again after what happened. We never found out who called the police that day or if 911 sent a patrol car after my call was cut off, but we were very lucky that they arrived at that hellish place right then and there. I was excited that my new partner and I, along with my friends Elvis and Howie, were able to record for our YouTube channel, which was called Follow the Footsteps. The concept is that we were ghost cracks and wanted to explore places where something paranormal could happen to us. The concept was great. The problem is that ghosts can be pretty elusive when they want to be, so we didn't have much luck. The most surprising thing that happened to us was seeing something moving from time to time or hearing strange noises, which could easily be just a figment of our imagination and random sounds from an old house or trees or the wind, but nothing that was forceful. After several failed explorations, it was beginning to seem to me that every place we visited was a copy of another. An old building here, a park there, a school over there. They were just different locations with the same vibe, so my friends and I were losing faith in finding any ghosts, and instead, we ended up watching our own recordings feeling very disappointed. That's when we thought about doing a set where we could create our own ghostly atmosphere, even if we had to set up something fake to do it. Yes, I know that's not ethical at all, but believe me when I tell you that most paranormal-themed YouTubers do it. And after failing time and time again in all our attempts, we understood why. We started doing this, and the truth is that everything was going very well, until we received an email from a stranger who talked about a place where so far several people had disappeared. According to them, it was the creepiest place in the country, and when we started researching on the internet, we realized that it did exist, and that so far, no one had made a video about it. This really didn't excite us, so without a second thought, we packed up our stuff and went for the adventure. We didn't want to pass up that opportunity, as the site was full of ghost stories, and as far as we could see from the pictures, it was still in pretty good shape. The site was 3 miles from the other places we had explored earlier, in a small and little-known village, but the property was also quite remote from the main hamlet. As we got closer, excitement and fear crept up on us more and more. When we finally arrived, we took videos and pictures of the entire building on the outside, as well as the surrounding area, as the property was a fairly large piece of land. After walking around, taking pictures from every possible angle, we finally decided it was time to go inside. The front door was open, but as empty as it looked, we didn't even flinch. Stepping over the threshold, we were met with a super dusty place. There were cobwebs everywhere, and there didn't seem to be an inch of space that wasn't covered in dust, But despite the sloppiness, the house was surprisingly intact. The things inside weren't broken, and although the pictures no longer hung, the walls were covered with thick white paint that had darkened with grime. But other than that, there was nothing really wrong. I started joking with the guys about how it was obvious that there were no children in the house because aside from the deterioration due to the action of time, the walls were spotless, which made it clear that there was never a child scribbling around there. Making a joke, I greeted what might be a ghostly presence in the corner and said, "Hey buddy, what's up? Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel," and we all burst out laughing. Then one of my friends suggested, "Well, how about we start having some fun here?" We decided to capture some interesting shots on the first floor and already had about 13 clips. Then we went up to the second floor, which felt much more eerie, and my girl said to the others, "Hey, remember what I told you about in the van? If you see any dolls or anything disturbing, notice that they've moved or anything, you should act like you're really scared and expectant. It gives the video more excitement and everything looks more realistic." The guys and I took his advice and everything was coming together perfectly, so we were on the cusp of excitement. Just when we thought we were going to leave, all of a sudden we heard a voice that made us freeze. Wow, wow. There was a guy in a baseball cap. He closed the door and stood in front of us with a gun in his hand and said we couldn't leave anymore. The man mocked us, and before we could react, 4 more guys appeared and came up behind us. One of them grabbed my neck so I couldn't move, while the others grabbed our arms and started to tie our wrists. It was obvious that this was not the typical group that wandered around abandoned places to make art. These people were dangerous. I looked around and realized that this was not the situation I was expecting at all. As I was trying to get out the side, I saw that there were 2 other guys near the door, blocking our only way out. We were trapped, and it was ironic how in an instant, the atmosphere changed from fun to terrifying in a matter of seconds. This place, once just a YouTube adventure, had turned into something much more sinister, and not exactly because of ghosts. "Why are they doing this to us?" I asked fearfully. "Hey, I don't know who you are, but we're basically nobody. We're just ghost hunters who make content for YouTube." "Who are you?" I said, feeling very scared. "I'm sorry, but we can't answer your second question, but since you're in luck, I'll answer the first one. The reason why we are doing this is the following: that you are crazy. How did you think of coming alone and without any protection to a house where people get lost?" After these words, everyone started to laugh. Well, all the bad guys, because my friends, my girl and I were terrified. At that moment, I remembered the mail we had received, which had been sent anonymously and did not urge us to come here. Could it be that it was these same guys who had sent that mail to set us up? Was the first thing I thought about. "Please let us go. We won't say anything to anyone, we won't call the police, we'll just leave and we won't do anything," said DC with tears in her eyes. At that moment, everyone started laughing again as if she was saying something very funny. Suddenly, one of the men took out his camera and took pictures of DC's face and then started to make a video. Then another man began to approach her with a pair of scissors in his hand. "What are you doing?" I yelled at the guy as he approached my girlfriend. He started laughing, as did his henchman, and told me that just as we had our audience, they had theirs. The guy started cutting DC's clothes off, while the other guy was recording her with his phone. Suddenly, he started saying, "What do you say, John? Do you like it for business?" And then he started recording the rest of us while telling whoever he was talking to on the phone that he had new merchandise. The guy said in a mocking tone that in addition to the white one, referring to Daisy, he had 3 pairs of lungs, 3 hearts, 3 livers, and 3 pairs of kidneys that would fix their month. At that point, we all looked at each other in panic, realizing the type of people we were dealing with. These guys were organ and human traffickers, if those terminologies can be separated. Daisy, who was crying and screaming her head off, started having what looked like a panic attack and was having trouble breathing. I was going crazy, screaming for them to help her, to please let her go, while my friends were pleading for their lives, yet deep down we knew it would all be in vain. If these people were who we thought they were, they would never let us escape, because as the camera guy himself said, we were worth a lot of money. Daisy started hyperventilating, repeating over and over that she couldn't breathe, so the other guy slapped her face, telling her to calm down. This infuriated me and made me feel a huge sense of helplessness. I started screaming and kicking, but there was no way to get out of the ropes with which my hands and feet had not been tied. I felt helpless, desperate, angry, and terrified in equal parts. My heart was pounding so hard I felt like it was going to burst out of my throat at some point when suddenly we heard a roar at the entrance, and in the blink of an eye, an army of uniformed guys in dark suits entered the place, armed to the teeth and shouting, "Cops, drop your guns and put your hands up." The guys looked at each other in surprise but had no time to react. The uniformed men not only caught them off guard but also outnumbered them, and not by a little. At that instant, I felt my heart freeze. In my mind, the image of a bloody shootout between the cops and the thugs with us in the middle played in my mind, but fortunately that didn't happen. Instead, the guys threw a couple of curses but threw their weapons to the ground and surrendered. The cops took the men away and provided assistance to my friends and me, especially Daisy, who was still in shock. After that, they took us to the station to give statements and later allowed us to go home, as none of us had serious injuries. It turned out that they belonged to a dangerous criminal organization that operated in several states of the country and engaged in a number of illicit activities, including organ trafficking, human trafficking, and drug trafficking. They all went to prison, but the organization has not yet been fully dismantled and continues to commit these criminal acts to this day. Daisy and I are no longer together, but we both feel very fortunate to have come out of that situation alive, as we were very close to being part of the long list of people disappeared by this group. After that experience, our career as urban exploration YouTubers ended for good. Instead, we now run a channel in which we dedicate ourselves to tell police chronicles, and we have been doing very well. I've always been a big fan of horror movies. This anecdote is from the time Annabelle was released. I went to the movies with my friends Freya and Sam, and we were super pumped after watching the movie. The idea of moving into a place and experiencing strange phenomena filled us with adrenaline. One night, Freya and I decided to set up a sleepover at Sam's house and were cozying up in his room when Sam started commenting on some articles he had seen on the internet talking about haunted houses. I was sitting on the edge of his window enjoying a cigarette when Sam said, "Hey, pass me a drag." I passed him the cigarette and told him that I had seen stories like that too, and that it would be cool to visit one of those haunted houses that they talk about so much on the internet. Sam exhaled the smoke outside and commented, "Who says you can't?" I just smiled in a mysterious way. Freya, surprised, asked, "What do you mean?" Sam then turned to us and mentioned, "There's a house near the north end of the park. It's about a 30-minute drive from here, and legend has it that it's haunted." Freya scratched her head and said, "Oh, you mean the Leister house?" As they talked, my eyes went from one to the other because I knew nothing about that house and had never heard of it. So I interrupted and asked what that whole thing was about. Freya got out of bed, turned on her laptop, and after searching for a moment said, "Yes, you're right. I read about that place and the terrible and strange history that surrounds it. Years ago, a man named William Leister lived there. He had a beautiful daughter, but he was super strict with her and hardly ever let her out. One day he found out that she was dating the mailman, and he got so angry that he pushed her down the stairs. The girl broke her back and never walked again. They say that at night he would crawl around the house like a dog, and a week later, the neighbor called the police because there was a funny smell coming from the house, and when the officers went inside, they found William dead near the stairs. He had fallen and broken his neck, but when they went upstairs to the bedrooms, they also found his daughter lifeless in her bed." Hearing the story, I smiled and said, "Okay, it may be horrible, but what's in that? Maybe she took revenge on him and then took her own life." Then, with eyes wide as saucers, Sam replied, "The strange thing is, according to the coroner, the girl died on May 20th at 2 p.m. in her bed, and the old man also died the next day at the same time. There was no sign of anyone forcing their way into the house, so there are those who believe that what happened is that it was the daughter's angry spirit that did away with her father." Freya was very interested with the idea of exploring the place, and Sam and I were in total agreement, so we planned to go to the old Leister house that same weekend. I took my brother's car and we set off that Saturday afternoon. We wanted to do the tour in the evening to add a little more excitement and mystery to the whole thing. I will definitely always regret making that decision. Sam, I was right. It took us quite a while, but we finally arrived at the property. The first thing I noticed was that it was in front of a beautiful lake, which loomed like a mirror under the starry sky, and in the background stood the huge building, which looked really ghostly, without a single spotlight amidst the darkness of the night. We parked near the lake on that full moon night, which illuminated the whole area around the Leister house on the other side. We had no idea how to get there, But lucky for us, there were two small boats moored to a wooden dock. I must confess that the atmosphere was really eerie, as in the night silence we could only hear the crickets, the wind blowing and the waves breaking gently on the shore. Sam locked the car, and without wasting much time, we climbed into one of the boats. While he and I started paddling, Freya focused on fixing our flashlight and illuminating everything around us to make sure no one was around. When we finally reached the other shore, the house looked even scarier than before. Broken windows that looked like they were about to fall out. Weeds covered the walls like a blanket, and there was no sign of light inside. It was like a huge wolf's den. As we stepped onto the porch, the front door creaked open, indicating that no one had been there in ages. We turned on the flashlight, and suddenly a cloud of bats flew overhead, immediately startling us. "Are you guys sure about this?" I asked in a whisper. Sam, without losing his cool, said, "Come on, stop being chicken." I knew Freya was as nervous as I was, but she wanted to act brave by saying she would go first, so I reluctantly went in behind them. Everything was completely dark, lit only by our flashlight and the faint moonlight sneaking in through a broken window. No sooner had we stepped through the door than we found ourselves in the living room, and then we noticed a huge staircase in the center. Sam, in a low tone, commented, "This is the ladder from which Mr. Leister fell and broke his neck." The staircase was covered with cobwebs and dust everywhere. I even saw some bats hanging from the ceiling. Just then, Freya shone her flashlight into a corner and sneered, "Look at this, guys." We walked over to where she pointed and saw a picture hanging on the wall. An old man with a fierce look on his face, standing next to a fireplace. And next to him, a young girl sitting on one of those old-fashioned chairs that looked like thrones. It should be noted, this incident occurred in the late 40s, so that painting must have been at least 70 years old. "That must be Mr. Millard and his daughter," Leo said. The girl was indeed beautiful, but there was something unsettling about her expression, even in that painting. It was evident that the atmosphere was charged with sadness. It looked as if the girl in the portrait was about to cry at any moment. At this, Sam, ever playful, blurted out a sarcastic comment. "Wow, she really was very pretty. If she were here, I'd have to lock her up too, but to take care of her for me." His jokes were getting on my nerves. I replied, "Stop making those kinds of comments. It's very disrespectful considering all that girl went through." He just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Whatever you say." Then he started heading for the stairs. "Where are you going?" asked Freya. "I'm going to see the girls' room," Sam replied and continued, "We've come all this way from so far away, and now we're not going to explore the house." At that moment, Freya joined him, so I decided to follow them too. No way would I stay alone on the first floor. But at that very moment, I thought I heard a chuckle behind me. "Guys, did you hear that?" I said. Before I could explain what I heard Sam from the second floor, "Come on, stop acting like a child." I felt a little offended but decided not to answer him and just go upstairs. The wooden planks creaked under my feet, and when I got to the top, I found Freya and Sam standing in front of a closed door. "What's wrong?" I asked. "It looks like the door is stuck," Freya replied as she tried to turn the knob. "Let me try," Sam said, and started pushing with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. We were standing there, planted in front of that door, not knowing what to do when suddenly we heard that chuckle again. The sound took us by surprise, and immediately a shiver began to run through our bodies. "Guys, I heard that earlier. I think we should go now. We have enough," I said, starting to panic. Freya started to light up around her and suddenly muttered, "Maybe it's coming from this room." To which, to our surprise, the doorknob clicked on its own and opened. We looked at each other and then looked inside. It was an old, dusty room. In the center was a dirty, ancient, unmade bed, and moonlight streamed in through the window, illuminating the scene. But just as we were about to enter, we heard the laughter again, this time with a more feminine touch, which sent a shiver down my spine. "Guys, let's go," I muttered. Suddenly, Sam pointed to the side of the bed facing the window and said in a shaky voice, "What's that, guys?" I felt like I was on the verge of a seizure, because from the window something was moving. It looked to me like a creature that resembled a dog, but we couldn't make things out very well in that darkness. Freya, with her flashlight, focused on where she thought the thing was, and at that instant our blood ran cold. There, near the window, was a girl on the floor, hunched over as if waiting for something. For a second we were all silent. Nothing could come out of our mouths. It was as if time stood still and our hearts stopped beating. Suddenly, the girl looked up, and Freya's flashlight began to flicker. We couldn't quite make out her face because of the flickering light, but each time it flickered on and off, we began to get a glimpse of her face. In the first flash, he was sad. In the second, he was smiling maniacally. And in the third, his expression was vacant, with two large, whitish eyes that seemed to pierce through us. The situation was so surreal that we even forgot to run away. But in one of those moments, the girl let out a chilling laugh and suddenly started crawling towards us like a hungry demon. At that instant, we all snapped out of the state of paralysis we were in and ran away as if we were being chased by death itself. Sam and I were in front, while poor Freya was screaming behind us like she was 10 years old again. "Don't leave me here, please, she's coming after me." When we reached the front door, Sam and I turned to see Freya barely making her way down the stairs, with the girl trailing behind him like a wild animal. I immediately ran over there, grabbed her by the hand, and dragged her with me at full speed to the exit. But I could feel the girl crawling after us almost at our heels. But somehow, just when it seemed that all was lost, we managed to escape from the house and jump into the same boat we arrived in. However, in the midst of the chaos, Freya dropped the flashlight into the lake, while Sam and I started paddling like crazy. She sat in the boat looking toward the house, growing paler and paler, muttering that I could still hear her evil laugh. "Faster, faster," she cried in desperation. At that moment, I turned for an instant and replied that there was nothing in sight, but the truth was that I could barely contain my fear. "I may not be able to get out of the house," Sam said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I preferred silence and kept paddling. My mind was so blocked I have no idea how we made it home that night, but since that day any news of haunted places sends a shiver down my spine. My friends and I used to hang out on the roof of an old abandoned hospital in town. There was a staircase leading up to the roof, but the door below was locked. So we soon realized that from the outside it was fairly easy to climb up to a small little wall on the second floor, which was about 8 feet up. From there, we just had to climb the remaining stairs to reach the roof. One night, it was just my friend Andy and I in the old hospital, so we decided to relax for a while on the floor below, having a few drinks and a smoke. While we were there, talking and enjoying ourselves, I suddenly noticed a pair of eyes watching us from upstairs, on the second floor. I got so scared that I jumped off the little wall I was sitting on, but in an instant those eyes disappeared behind the wall. "Dude, I'm sure there's someone up there," I said. My friend looked at me, thinking that maybe the smoke was getting to me, but he soon recognized that I was really worried. "Is anyone up there?" I called out. There was no answer, so to relax, I decided we should go upstairs. We didn't want any trouble. I called again and my voice echoed throughout the empty structure, but then came silence. My friend looked at me and shrugged, basically convinced that it was all a figment of my imagination, so we started climbing. About halfway up, a head popped up peeking over the wall, and I saw that it was a rather unkempt guy, his hair a mess and dirty. "Hi!" he suddenly shouted, trying not to scare us. I looked at my friend nervous, and he gave me the same look back, but we decided to keep going. We continued up and went over the wall where the stranger was waiting for us. He turned around and picked up the bottle of whiskey I passed him before I went up myself. When we reached the landing, which was practically empty except for a bit of dirt, we found a sleeping bag, a grimy ice chest, and a duffel bag in disrepair. There was also a kitchen knife, clear signs that this was a homeless person who looked like he had been living there. The guy came out from behind a small wall and looked at us smiling, then apologized for scaring us. My friend and I offered him to join us for drinks and also offered him a cigarette, which made him smile. Andy had a small portable cooler where he had some still somewhat cold beers. So we offered him one, and he gladly accepted, saying he preferred beer to whiskey. So we gave him an open one and stood in silence for a while, enjoying the stars and smoking together. We were drinking and smoking for a while in silence when suddenly the homeless man turned to us and said, "This is a test, right?" I looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He continued, "They're testing me again, trying to see what I'm made of. Are you demons? It's been so long since I last saw demons, I thought I was free, but here they are again." Andy and I exchanged nervous glances as we listened to him. Suddenly, I noticed that the kitchen knife was no longer lying on the floor, and I started to get nervous. This guy was totally convinced that we were demons, and the insanity of being trapped with a delusional stranger on a roof and with no escape sent chills down my spine. The man went on and on saying weird things about demons and being tempted, before breathing heavily and starting to repeat, "I'm not going with you. I will never stop running away. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to go to hell. I just want to stay here, please." After these words, the man backed himself into a corner as if he was trying to escape from us. At that moment, I got scared and didn't want the situation to become dangerous, so I raised my hands, showing my palms. "It's okay, buddy, just relax. We're about to leave. We don't want anything from you," I told him. So he sat down, put his head in his hands, and started crying loudly like a little kid. This guy, who at first just seemed nice now, thought we were demons and was crying in some kind of crisis. And while he was very scared of the demons he thought we were twice as scared, thinking that at any moment he might attack us. Without looking back, we started backing slowly to the edge of the roof. Then I swung a leg over and quickly climbed down while Andy descended right behind me. As soon as we hit the ground, we ran out of there and back to my house, where we closed the door behind us and collapsed on the couch, first scared and breathing very fast and then laughing nervously. We realized that in the midst of that bizarre situation, we left the bottle of whiskey on the roof of the hospital and joked about whether we should go back to get it. But we both knew there was no way we were going back to that place with that madman around. After that, we never went back to that place, and sometimes, as we joked about being demons, a shiver would run through my body and relive that unsettling feeling in my stomach. Although we didn't take them humorously in the end, the truth is that that experience left a mark on me and changed the way I looked at strangers. I never again took it for granted that someone was harmless or normal. Even though that guy didn't hurt us, I sometimes wonder what would have become of him and if he finally managed to find some peace. The sad truth is that he probably didn't, but I also wonder what would have happened if he had decided to attack us with the knife that day. I don't even want to imagine it, but there sure wouldn't have been a very good ending to this story. The truth is that I grew up on a farm, and my parents were one of those lifelong farmers in the country. For as long as I can remember, I've been helping them with whatever they needed. Milking cows, collecting fresh eggs from the chicken coop, carrying bales of hay. You know, those things you see in the movies about rural life that we country folks consider a sign of hard work. My parents were quite traditional, especially my dad, who had a very peculiar way of looking at things. His discipline was, in the best of words, a bit harsh. He couldn't tell the difference between a spanking and something that crossed the line into abuse. It's not that he was a rebellious child or anything like that. He was just a bit clumsy and sometimes made mistakes. But his punishments were more often than not disproportionate. I remember one time in particular when I dropped a bucket of milk and my father's reaction was, well, chilling. He whipped me with a leather belt in such a way that I fell down fainting, while my mother in a corner could only look on sadly, as if everything was completely out of her control. That was the last straw for me. At that time I was 16 years old, but a couple of years later, I was fed up with life in the countryside and my dad's violence as well as my mom's indifference, so one day I decided to move and look for a new future in the big city. My parents were not at all in agreement, of course, but I was of age and they couldn't stop me. So once I turned 18, I got into my second-hand car, really cheap, but at least it was mine, and left without looking back. I just left them a note with a clear message. I was taking charge of my life, and that included getting away from them. From then on, I didn't return to the farm for 16 years. It was a long time and full of changes. Life in the city was radically different from what I had known, and the truth is that I didn't regret it in the least. Until one day, I was in my little studio surrounded by papers and exhausted from a soul-sucking corporate job, when suddenly, I heard a doorbell ring. It struck me as odd because, honestly, I didn't get many visitors. I was so focused on my work that I didn't have time to make friends. When I opened the door, I was met by a middle-aged man in a dark, somewhat ill-fitting suit, holding a brown leather briefcase in one hand. At first glance, I thought he was one of those salesmen knocking on doors to offer you any nonsense, and that immediately annoyed me. I was trying to unwind after a week of mind-numbing work, and this was supposed to be my one day off, a day when I could do whatever I wanted without my boss looking over my shoulder. So in a rather irritated tone, I blurted out, "Look, buddy, whatever you're selling, I'm not interested." I barely tried to close the door, but he, quick as lightning, stuck a boot-covered foot right between the frame and the door. "I'm not a salesman," the guy said, and his tone was different, more serious. The guy had a calm voice, but you could tell he was tired. "I'm a private investigator," he said. "I need to talk to you about something important." I opened the door a little wider, but still kept my hand on the handle, hesitating. Why would anyone want to hire a private investigator to find me? The expression on his face turned serious. "It's about your parents," he said with a somber tone. What he said next chilled me. My father had passed away over 3 years ago, and my mother had apparently completely lost her mind and had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital for her own safety and the safety of others. With my father dead and my mother considered mentally unstable, her lawyer had decided to hire a private investigator to track me down so he could transfer ownership of the farm to me. The next few days were complete chaos. After confirming my identity, the investigator took me to meet my mother's lawyer to sign the documents for the transfer of ownership of the farm. I signed where I was instructed, and after offering me some rather perfunctory condolences, they both disappeared from my life as quickly as they had arrived. After that, it took me another week to work up the courage to return to that old farm, until finally I called my boss to let him know I would be gone for a week, and got into the same beat-up car I had used to leave the farm so many years before. Returning to that place after nearly 2 decades was a heavy blow. To say it was in bad shape would be an understatement. Despite all the painful memories I had of there, it was somehow my childhood home, and it pained me to see it so desolate. Weeds had invaded the fields that had once been carefully tended. The few remaining pigs were so skinny and malnourished it was a wonder they were still alive. Their feed troughs were empty and covered with dust. It seemed no one had cared for them in years. I couldn't understand how they could survive without anyone feeding them. Then I saw a group of younger pigs in a corner, greedily eating something. I moved a little closer to see what it was, and when I recognized it, I felt sick to my stomach. They were around the carcass of an old pig, devouring its flesh and bones mercilessly. The situation was so grotesque that I turned around and left the barn in disgust. I decided to check on the cows, and fortunately, they were still grazing in the field, but one of them lay dead, decomposing, surrounded by flies. I couldn't tell if she had died of old age or if a predator had attacked her, but her body was so dry it was scary. After taking a moment to process how disastrous the place had become, I decided to go inside the house to clear my head, but sure enough, everything there was just as neglected as the rest of the property. A layer of dust covered every surface, and cobwebs adorned every dark corner. There was even a tower of dirty dishes in the sink, stagnant in a gray water that was disgusting. The homesickness I had felt upon returning quickly faded, replaced by a sense of deep sadness and hopelessness. According to the lawyer, my mother had been living at the farm until she was locked up in the psychiatric ward just a month ago. However, the place had an air of neglect that seemed to have lasted for years, so I assumed she began to neglect it after my father passed away. My parents' room was a shambles, with clothes thrown all over the place or stuffed anyway in drawers. Oddly enough, the only room that was in top condition was mine, which looked spotless except for a few dusty corners. Everything was just as I had left it, from the Blink 182 poster I hung on the wall when I was a fanatical teenager to the bookshelf full of those adventure books I could never take with me. There was even a goodbye letter I left on the desk, though it now had several dried liquid stains that weren't there when I left. I tried hard not to think they were my mother's tears. Sitting on the bed I used as a child, perfectly made up, I realized that despite everything, she had cared about me. She may never have been able to protect me from my father's beatings, but deep down, her love was evident. At that point, I decided that I needed to refocus my efforts. I wanted to fix up the farm so that when she returned, it would be in better condition. I spent the next day cleaning everything up and feeding the pigs in the barn, something they hadn't done in years. And I also took care of the carcass of the cow, burning it on a large pyre. Normally, a dead cow would be composted, but I didn't know if it had died of disease, and I didn't want to risk contaminating the soil. After that, I sat in a folding chair and watched the flames consume the carcass, with a fire extinguisher at my side and a hunting rifle slung across my back. I wanted to be ready in case some predator attacked again. I had been watching the fire for about an hour when I noticed something moving at the edge of my view. The sun had set and I could only see the glow of the fire, but something was approaching from the darkness, shrouded in shadows. I couldn't make out what it was, but its blurry outline made me think of an animal. I guessed it might be a wolf. So I pulled out the rifle and fired, not really expecting to hit it, just to scare it off. But just as I pulled the trigger, a piercing scream broke the night, and it wasn't the howl of an animal. My eyes widened in horror as I realized it was a human scream, and I immediately ran toward the sound. As I arrived, the horrible truth became apparent. On the ground, with a bullet in her chest, lay an old woman. Her hair was so tangled that I mistook it for the fur of an animal in the dark, and she was wearing only a light green tunic and baggy pants, like those a patient would wear in a hospital. A shiver ran down my spine as I understood the terrible turn of events. After a full minute of being shocked, horrified at what I had inadvertently done, I snapped back to reality and tried to think of what to do. I should have called the police. After all, it was a real accident, and technically the woman was trespassing on my property. But in the midst of my panic and cowardice, I could only think of one way to dispose of the body, so I lifted the old woman's body and threw it into the bonfire next to the cow. That took me forever. I was so stunned and horrified at everything that had happened as I watched the flames devour both bodies. My hands were trembling and drenched in sweat as my fear chilled me. In the end, only brittle bones remained, which I crumbled to ashes. That night I slept fitfully, terrified that someone might come looking for that woman. At dawn, my fears were realized when I heard a knock at the door. As I was eating breakfast, I saw a police car parked outside and thought it couldn't get any worse, but I was wrong. I opened the door and was met by a young officer. "Good morning, officer," I tried to say as normally as possible. "Is something wrong?" "It's about your mother," the officer replied. "What about her?" I asked, confused. "She escaped from the mental institution last night. One of the nurses told us she was going back to the family farm. We wanted to know if you've seen her." The officer pulled out his phone and showed me a picture. He said that since he hadn't seen her in a long time, he might not recognize her, but this is what she should look like now. I looked at the photo and felt my heart stop. The woman in the picture was the same woman I had mistaken for an animal the night before. That woman I accidentally killed and burned with the carcass of a cow was none other than my own mother. I tried to keep my composure and told the officer that I had not seen her, but I could not hide the terror in my voice. He seemed concerned for her welfare, assuring me that she would soon be found, that there weren't many places to hide in the countryside. I thanked him, even though I knew deep down that no one would ever find her again. I left the farm immediately after that and returned to the city. But although I tried to resume my normal life, my mind would not leave me alone. Nightmares tormented me, and in them I saw my mother crying, still bleeding from the bullet hole in her chest. That had happened more than a decade ago. Now I am determined to go back to the farm one last time. I can't live with this guilt any longer, so I've made a decision. I won't live anymore. I carry my hunting rifle with me, but this time, the only one I will shoot will be me.